Life is not a problem to be solved. Just remember to have something that keeps you busy doing what you love, while being surrounded by the people who love you. Hector Garcia. Let me tell you a story and see if it sounds familiar. This is a story of someone who moves through their day-to-day life, constantly pushing through discomfort. Sometimes that discomfort takes the form of stress. Other times it shows up as a quiet, persistent boredom that never really goes away. But according to the philosophy of Ikigai, the root of this feeling goes deeper than simply having a job we dislike or a routine that doesn't excite us. It points to something more fundamental, a deeper disconnect between how we're living and what actually gives our life meaning. This school of thought suggests that this feeling of restlessness comes from not yet discovering our own Ikigai, which means our reason for being, the underlying why behind how we live our lives. It's that quiet sense of purpose that gives us a genuine reason to get up each morning. Not out of obligation, but out of intention. And yet, modern life pulls us in a different direction. It teaches us to prioritize productivity, results, and goals above all else, while meaning is left as something secondary, something we'll figure out later. Over time, this disconnect begins to show. Work becomes mechanical, something we endure rather than engage with, and we find ourselves retiring from purpose mentally long before we leave work physically. Out of this, a kind of spiritual frustration begins to build. A tension between wanting to live a meaningful life and feeling stuck in something that doesn't quite feel like living at all. As Hector Garcia puts it, our Ikigai is different for all of us, but one thing we have in common is that we are all searching for meaning. And yet, in that search, we often fall into a few common traps. We assume that our purpose is something that will be given to us, when in reality, it's something that must be discovered, gradually, through experience, curiosity, and a willingness to explore different paths. It doesn't arrive all at once, fully formed, but reveals itself over time. But we also tend to believe that purpose is something grand, something impressive, visible, or externally validated. But Ikigai doesn't work like that. It doesn't have to be extraordinary, but it does have to be personal. For one person, it might be building a business or pursuing a calling. But for another, it could be something far quieter, tending to a garden, raising a family, or dedicating themselves to a craft. It's tough to find any job that isn't repetitive. Yet there are those who approach it with complete focus and genuine satisfaction. For many of us, the repetition is what makes it feel unbearable. But when there is meaning behind what we do, repetition changes. It stops feeling like a burden and begins to feel like something closer to rhythm. And this leads us to one final misunderstanding. We often think of purpose as something tied to our careers, something we eventually grow out of or retire from. But Ikigai doesn't follow that pattern. Jobs become draining when they turn into means to an end, when they lose their connection to anything meaningful. Ikigai, on the other hand, is different. It's not something you step away from. It's something you continue to return to again and again because it's part of who you are. That's the real distinction. It's not just what you do for work. It's what gives your life direction, consistency, and meaning, regardless of what stage of life you're in. While discovering your Ikigai is the cornerstone of the philosophy, it rests on a few other important habits. Staying active, eating well, connecting with others, and finding a sense of flow in what we do. Flow is the moment when you become so immersed in a task that everything else falls away. Time seems to disappear, and your attention narrows entirely onto what's in front of you. We often associate this state with creativity or high-level work, a musician composing a piece of music, or a scientist solving a complex problem. But it isn't limited to that. It can be found in far more ordinary moments. Ikigai teaches us to notice what you might call microflow, small pockets of focus throughout the day that break up the routine. Something as simple as washing the dishes can become absorbing if you approach it with intention, if you try to do it properly, rather than just getting it over with. This is where a subtle shift begins to take place. Most of us assume that the quicker we rush through something, or the less effort we give it, the faster time will pass. But in reality, the opposite tends to be true. When we give our full attention to a task, when we engage with it rather than resist it, time often feels like it moves more quickly. And more importantly, it feels less draining. Because our mind isn't drifting off to something we'd rather be doing, which is quietly reinforcing the idea that what we're doing is now meaningless. This idea of treating everyday actions as something closer to a ritual rather than a chore is central to the Ikigai mindset. It reflects a broader way of living where even the simplest tasks are approached with care and intention. As Epictetus once said, "Remember that you are an actor in a play. You must play the part assigned to you as well as you can." And in many ways, that's why Ikigai is not about escaping the ordinary parts of life, but learning to engage with them fully. Alongside finding flow, daily movement is another essential part of the picture. It doesn't need to be extreme or intense. In fact, the philosophy points in the opposite direction. Moving a little every day is far more valuable than doing nothing all week, then forcing yourself through a long, exhausting workout at the weekend. In a world where so much of our time is spent sitting behind desks, we have to make a conscious effort to step away from that stillness and bring movement back into our lives. Not as punishment, and not as something we have to do, but as a simple, consistent way of keeping ourselves engaged with our bodies. The aim isn't perfection or high performance. It's not about training for an Olympic medal or pushing yourself to extremes. It's about avoiding stagnation, physically and mentally, by building a routine that you can return to day after day. Small movements repeated over time begin to compound into something much more meaningful, and in many ways, this ties back to everything we've already explored. It's another example of taking something simple and turning it into a ritual, rather than treating it as an occasional obligation. As Hector Garcia puts it, only staying active will make you want to live 100 years. And beneath that idea is something deeper, that movement isn't just about health or longevity, but about staying connected to life itself in a steady, ongoing way. Another important principle with Ikigai is what's known as Hari Hachibu, which simply means eating until you're around 80% full. It sounds simple, but when you think about it, it runs counter to how many of us approach food. We tend to swing between extremes, overeating until we feel uncomfortable, or restricting ourselves throughout the week only to overindulge when we feel we've earned a cheat day. But Ikigai takes a more balanced approach. Just like movement and flow, it's not about extremes, but consistency. Instead of treating food as something to binge on or control rigidly, it becomes something we engage with more mindfully, day after day. Eating until we're simply full enough, rather than completely full, encourages a steadier rhythm. It's another example of stepping away from that cycle of excess and deprivation and moving towards something more sustainable. And, much like the other principles, it's not just about physical health. It reflects a broader mindset, one of moderation, awareness, and learning when to stop, rather than always pushing for more. Finally, the social side of life carries just as much weight as everything else we've explored. Even though our Ikigai is something deeply personal, it doesn't mean we're meant to live in isolation. In fact, the opposite tends to be true. Just as our sense of purpose shouldn't be shallow, neither should our relationships. There's a depth to be found in truly connecting with the people around us, in building friendships that last, in supporting those close to us, and contributing to a wider community. Whether that's helping a neighbour, having a meaningful conversation with someone at work, or simply showing up for the people in our lives, these connections give substance to everything else we do. Living according to Ikigai may be a personal journey, but it's not one we have to walk alone. And beneath all of these ideas, movement, flow, balance, and connection, sits one unifying principle: the difference between goals and rituals. A goal is something we aim towards, something finite. We reach it, and then naturally we look for the next one. But a ritual goes deeper than that. A ritual is ongoing. It doesn't have a clear end point. It's something we return to again and again, often in ways that feel repetitive on the surface. But that repetition is the point. It's what transforms ordinary actions into something meaningful. Because of this, the core elements of Ikigai aren't things to achieve and then move on from. They're things to practice. Daily movement, finding moments of flow, eating with balance, and nurturing relationships. These aren't milestones. They're rhythms. They're patterns we build into our lives and return to with the same level of care each time. As Confucius puts it, if I am not fully present at the ritual, it is as if I did not perform it at all. Not just doing things, but being fully engaged in them. So even in something as structured or repetitive as completing reports at work, there is an opportunity to approach it differently. Instead of rushing through it, you decide how you want to do it. The structure, the clarity, the presentation, and you carry that out with intention. Then you return to it next time with the same mindset. Over time, it stops feeling like a task to endure and begins to feel more like a practice to refine. In the same way a musician can play the same piece of music 1,000 times and still find something within it, there's a way of approaching our own work, our own lives, that brings depth to repetition, rather than trying to escape it. Because when we truly commit to living in line with our Ikigai, something begins to shift. Not sudden, but quietly. Life starts to feel different. It slows down. It feels fuller and more deliberate. Time is no longer something we're constantly chasing or trying to outrun, but something we begin to experience more deeply. And as that depth replaces the shallowness, our days start to sustain us rather than drain us. We're no longer just pushing through the week, waiting for the next milestone or moment of relief. Instead, we begin to enjoy the process of living itself. At the same time, our relationship with mortality begins to change. We still understand that life is finite, that our time here is limited, but instead of that creating pressure or pessimism, it brings a kind of clarity. Yes, the routine parts of life will always be there. The dishes will need to be washed, the clothes will need to be cleaned, but we no longer resent these moments because they become part of something else, part of a rhythm, a ritual, and more importantly, we're no longer waiting for life to start. We're already living it, every day, even in the smallest tasks that once felt insignificant. And in that way, life begins to feel longer. Not because there's more of it, but because we're fully present inside it. We feel connected to what we do, to the people around us, and to ourselves. As Seneca once said, life, if well lived, is long enough. And that idea sits at the heart of this philosophy. Ikigai doesn't promise a perfect life or a life free from difficulty. Instead, it offers something far more realistic and far more sustainable. A way of living that makes the ordinary feel meaningful. In many ways, it acts as an antidote to the modern way of living. It reminds us that even in a world built around speed, productivity, and constant distraction, it's still possible to live a life that feels grounded, intentional, and full. But that responsibility sits with us. It's up to us to discover our own Ikigai, to stay present, and to find balance in the way we live. Because at its core, Ikigai isn't about tolerating the daily grind. It's about transforming it. It turns what feels like an obstacle to happiness into a fundamental part of it.